Welcome everybody. I'm Marco Storni, and I'll be the chair of this fourth session of the RENEW18 Open Research Seminar. This Open Research Seminar is an occasion for us members of the group of like RENEW18 responses to Newton in 18th century philosophy to discuss work in progress and current research with renowned scholar in the field of Newtonian studies or 18th century philosophy. And today we have the great pleasure of hosting Courtney Fugate, who is professor at Florida State University, who will present a paper entitled Universal Gravitation and the Moral Law, the Newtonian Framework for Kant's Fact of Reason. The session will be slightly different than the usual, so Courtney will have 15, 20 minutes to present the paper and this on research more generally. And then we will have, for the first time, a respondent, Leonid Zellini, who is a PhD student in our group and based at KU Leuven. And then the discussion will be open to everybody. So, Courtney, please, the floor is yours, and thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Marco. So first of all, let me say just thanks for the invitation, and it's a great honor to be invited. Although I do prefer honors that don't require me to get up so early in the morning, but I'm still very appreciative. So I imagine you've all read the paper, so I'm not going to go through and build my case piece by piece. I'm going to talk a little more generally, maybe talk about some things that I'm still. So the paper is still a work in progress. I finished it maybe a couple of months ago, and I've been letting it sit. And now that I've come back, there are things I definitely want to fix. And I'm hoping that some of you will have more expertise in the Newtonian area to sharpen me up. But generally, the paper, when I never saw myself as writing a paper like this. I would have never, I think a few years ago, I would have, if I had read the title myself, I would have thought it was, I was about to read a bunch of nonsense, because this connection between Newton and Kant's moral philosophy is extremely counterintuitive, I think, to most Kant scholars. But just slowly over time, working on Kant's methodology, in the pre-critical period, thanks to Karin asking me to do a chapter some while ago. And then I'd always been struck, I had noticed, kind of various features that had been missed in Kant's methodology in the pre-critical and the critical period that stem from the Newtonian framework. And that had always been in my mind. And I'd always been interested in this, I'd always noticed this analogy Kant draws between the moral law and the law of universal gravitation. And for a long time, I just thought that was a very clever, nice idea. Many other people had drawn that analogy in the period. Some of you are probably familiar with Berkeley's anonymous piece, where he compares something like the gestures towards universal gravitation and this kind of universal law of attraction within human beings. So it's something like this. But over time, thinking about and working on the second critique, I was always also puzzled by the first chapter of the second critique, the analytic, and never finding in the secondary literature any kind of explanation. This puzzled me for a long time, and I'm working on the Cambridge translation of that. And I was looking into the section titles and so on, and this idea occurred to me that perhaps Kant was modeling it somehow on the Principia. From that point on, it sort of became obvious to me over time that everything fell into place. And now I don't doubt that myself anymore. When I first came up with that thesis, I was somewhat doubtful. And now I think it's just kind of plainly staring us in the face, that there are traces all over. And then the question was, what is to be learned from this methodologically about the second critique? Is this just a kind of superficial, Kant imitating Newton as he was doing at various times? And I think Kant's mind worked this way. We see him kind of in the background, formulating ideas and doing it in a way that loosely rewrites what other writers are doing. There are often texts right behind what Kant is saying in his own text that are very structurally similar. So what's maybe the possible payoff for drawing this connection was the next question. I'm still kind of working on that a little bit. the philosophical payoff. So the two main problems in the second critique that this paper would answer or help, and they turn out to be connected, obviously, is that so there's this peculiar structure for the first chapter, and why does Kant use all these section titles that don't seem to have any place there? I mean, the most obvious reason being that Kant has, in the first critique, excluded the use of the mathematical method in philosophy, and yet he's adopted titles and section headings at the beginning of the second critique that are exactly drawn from the mathematical scientific tradition to structure it in terms of theorems and so on, right? And not only generally, as he does in some other texts with section headings and so on, but he even uses this structure of problems and things that you find only in kind of very hardcore scientific mathematical treatises. The second kind of problem, obviously, that everyone's familiar with the second critique, is this charge that Kant's method there is something like foot stamping or justification through theft, or that so that this reversal from the groundwork, the supposed reversal from the groundwork to the second critique, consists in Kant simply asserting that the moral law is valid without any kind of methodological foundation for defending it or justifying it. Now, according to the results of my paper, these two things are directly connected. We've missed the methodological foundation for the second critique. That's why we don't understand the structure of the first chapter. And we don't understand the structure of the first chapter because we haven't seen that Kant's method there is not a rationalist style method. Although a mathematical structure seems to suggest that, and I think that's been kind of a red herring for some in the research. The real foundation is Kant's attempt to defend the moral law like the Newtonians defended universal gravitation. So like in a very broad analogical sense. The main idea being that he wants to defend the law of the moral law as a absolutely first unconditioned practical principle that is universal in the same way universal gravitation is, and to do so without providing any kind of rationalistic deduction from a prior principle, right? And I think Kant's thinking about fundamental laws and fundamental forces and how to defend those more generally arises from the Newtonian framework, and that he's applying it directly there in the second critique. So he's thought very hard about how one should defend and how one could possibly defend an absolutely first normative principle, and that it can't be by tracing it back to a descriptive or theoretical principle, obviously, and it can't be traced to any deeper normative principle. And so the only way is to find a method by which to isolate it and defend it against all possible contrary principles, right? And this is what he takes this method from Newton, but more so in the actual structure of the analytic, the way it is structured. This also is parallel with the. So I think Kant took this analogy with the defense of gravitation in the Principia very, very seriously, and that the structure of the first part of the analytic, where he lays out the theorems and the basic concepts, parallels the first two books of Newton's Principia, and then there's this an analytic synthetic move that parallels the two main arguments in the Principia as well, and that's what's behind the two problems. So that's kind of the general idea. How do I try to defend this in the paper? I'm not going to go through all of that, but so just to come back, so the main thesis, if you missed it in the paper, is that I think Kant consciously developed the first chapter of the second critique and his moral methodology in the second critique in analogy with Newton's method in the Principia. And the question, of course, there's a lot of questions about what's the nature of that analogy and how it can, how it's possible for there to be such an analogy. At the end of the paper, and this is kind of a larger idea I've been thinking about, is developing this idea of Kant following a kind of meta-naturalistic meta-naturalism, right? Somewhat like, but in principle quite different from, radically different from, but somewhat like something that many people were doing. Hume is an example, looking to Newton's Principia and Newtonian philosophy in developing moral philosophy, right? Trying to generalize a successful model from the sciences to other areas. But I think Kant's method is much more elaborate because it's transcendental and because the analogy is not supposed to be based upon a generalization or reduction of the moral to some kind of subdomain of the scientific, but rather Kant looks at the structure of scientific rationality and then sees that as an instantiation of a higher transcendental structure of rationality, and therefore as applicable in across domains within philosophy, so between natural philosophy and a moral philosophy. So Kant's ultimate explanation there would be that we shouldn't be at all surprised that there's a parallel defense of the fundamental law of the physical world and the fundamental law of the moral world, because both of them are rooted in the basic structure of reason and its relationship to the world, right? So that's kind of this higher order question about Kant's methodology that's in the background. So as far as, someone can remind me, do I have like 5 minutes or four minutes, something like that?
Sure. Well, you can go.
Yeah,
5 minutes and 5.
I could even stop now, but
No.
I could review some things, huh? Go on.
No,
yeah,
please take your time. Take your time.
Okay, sure. I didn't know when we started. A couple of things about in the paper. So the general strategy was to show that Kant holds this analogy kind of in 3 parts between the moral law and universal gravitation. One is this kind of universal unifying character of both laws that he points out in both the pre-critical texts and in post-second critique texts, right? So I tried to show that he holds this analogy very strongly over a period that straddles the second critique, right? So that would show that he would look to Newton in the second critique itself. But also there's this parallel between the two as characterizing, as I've said, fundamental forces with fundamental laws. I think this might be why Kant calls the law of pure practical reason the fundamental law. It's a bit of a puzzle, right? That would explain that to a certain extent. And also already in the, I try to show that already in the pre-critical period in the prize essay, Kant was following something like this meta-naturalistic strategy, because he first looks to natural science to devise a method for metaphysics, and that method is Newtonian. And then at the end of the prize essay, he applies that in the moral domain, and it's exactly parallel, has exactly the same parallel structure. So Kant has done this before, looking to Newton. All of that is just to kind of suggest circumstantially that Kant might do this. I'll be interested to hear what you all think of the different aspects of the text I analyze. The 2 problems, I think the part about the 2 problems in the text, I rewrote that last night a little bit because I think I missed some things in Newton that made it much easier to make this case. But the general idea is that in the first chapter there, so there's this material that is purely conceptual analysis that parallels the first 2 books of the Principia, and then famously we all know Kant's Principia, Newton's method in general is analysis followed by synthesis, and in the Principia itself, the analytical move is justified and made possible by a certain set of inferences that can be made from the behavior of certain bodies to the existence of a fundamental force of universal gravitation, and then assuming that, Newton then demonstrates from that the phenomena. And this is basically the equivalence. Newton broadly is showing the equivalence between the existence of a certain law and the existence of a certain force and a certain lawful behavior, right? And this is the bidirectional equivalence, and it's proven by Newton in problems where Kant takes exactly the same kind of formula and text structure to do so. And I think this corresponds to what Kant does in the first chapter, and that allows us to then tease out what parts of the first chapter of the second critique are Kant making the analytical move from the law to freedom, and then the synthetic move from freedom to the sort of behavior that would follow from the moral law, and therefore this allows him to distinguish autonomy and heteronomy in a way that's very, very, at least to me, this was clarified the text in a lot of ways. The last stuff about Newton, I'm still about the Newtonians. I'm kind of, this is the more part I'm developing more. I don't know if I should get into that, but I mean, kind of the deeper, the lesson that I learned there is how the Newtonians, the word fact in the Newtonians really means effect. This is kind of the central meaning of it. And the reason it has that meaning is because they want to distinguish Newton's talk of gravitation as a cause, and say this is kind of a cause. It's a cause that one is tempted to say is a cause within the appearances, or it's a methodological cause. It's first in the order of second causes, as some of them say. And therefore, they're not talking about first causes or real causes or absolute causes. And this is an attempt to justify the use of universal gravitation within science as if it were absolutely first, while saying from the point of view of God, or point of view, a metaphysical point of view, that it is not first and is based upon grounds that are indemonstrable and unknowable. And in Kant's adoption of this term fact, I think he uses it in exactly the same way. To say the moral law is first in the order of practical reasoning for humans, but is not first in an absolute sense. And that this is part of the reason he designates that, uses that term. So I'm still kind of working through the Newtonian stuff there a little bit. That's all I'll say, I guess. I rambled for long enough.
Well,
I hope you enjoyed it.
Great. It was super interesting, and I guess Leone, you can we can move on to your comments to as a kickoff of the discussion. So please go ahead with your response.
Yes, thank you, Courtney, for this presentation.
Sure.
And I found your paper extremely valuable for several reasons. The first of them being your attempt to square two main tenets of Kant's philosophy within what is often called analogical Newtonianism. So the phrase analogical Newtonianism has been recently used, for example, by Charles Wolff, by Andrew Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
Several historians of science to describe a widespread tendency in the 18th century physiology and moral philosophy. Mm-hmm. And analogical Newtonianism may best be described as the attempt to investigate relatively unknown domains of inquiry by employing Newtonian notions and methodologies. And this is pretty much what you were referring to when making the case of Barclay's article. But I really appreciated your paper because to prove Kant's adoption of this research practice, to prove Kant's adoption of analogical Newtonianism is far from obvious. And in fact, two main tenets of Kant's philosophy seemingly impede him from boldly taking over Newtonian methodology. And these two tenets you deal with in your paper. And the first would be Kant's antinaturalism. And by this, I mean Kant's unwillingness to consider genuinely moral issues from the standpoint of experience or well-established physical theories. And of course, Kant adopts this kind of antinaturalistic stance not only in moral philosophy, but most notably in his conception of living beings. So there cannot be a Newton of the blade of grass.
Sure.
So this is the first Kantian tenet that makes it very difficult to prove that Kant was following some kind of analogical Newtonianism. And the second tenet is Kant's refusal to adopt the mathematical method when doing philosophy. And this is I would say this is a key assumption of his theoretical philosophy as a whole. So I think that the utmost virtue of your essay lies in this concern to show how Kant draws from Newtonian methodology without renouncing these two tenets. So the first of them being anti-naturalism, the second of them being the refusal of any application of mathematics within the field of philosophy. So my first two questions regard precisely this aspect of your paper. The third question addressing the possibility to further extend some of the results of your essay. So the first question, as said, concerns analogical Newtonianism and Kant's rejection of the mathematical method in philosophy. And according to what you write between at the end of page 3, beginning of page 4, Kant manages to follow Newton's method without infringing the prohibition to treat philosophical issues mathematically, because the Principius methodology is not the one Kant had in mind when banning mathematics from philosophy. And yet I asked myself whether one could elaborate on this point and further substantiate it with reference to Kant's notion of analogy. So you, as you were saying, you frame the relationship between the method Kant adopts in the analytic chapter of the second critique and the Newtonian method in terms of an analogy. And at least according to Kant, analogical relations subsist between heterogeneous domain. So when drawing an analogy, we do that because the domains are totally different, as he says in the prolegomena, for example.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask you, this is the first question, might not this very way of characterizing analogy account for Kant's ability to take over Newton's method without treating philosophical issues mathematically? And I think the same question might be asked with reference to Kant's account of metaphors in the third critique. So the labels Kant uses in the first chapter of the second critique, so like problem theorem, corollary, and this array of traditional mathematical titles. They might just be what Kant calls symbolical hypotheses, that is, metaphors. Kant then, he's not literally treating a philosophical issue in a mathematical way. He's rather using metaphors, or as he said, symbolical hypotheses. So again, my question is not the very notion of analogy as developed by Kant, or his conception of figurative language, which enables him to take over Newton's method without applying mathematics to philosophy. And of course, this is not in contradiction with your explanation of the compatibility between analogical Newtonianism, let's say, and the prohibition to treat philosophical issues from a mathematical point of view. But I wanted to ask you if this might be a further way of defending this claim you make. I'm not sure whether you wanted to answer now or if I should read the other two questions I have prepared.
That's a pretty, maybe I should, because I'll most likely forget. Briefly, and I can come back to it, I guess. I'll try to keep it very brief. So I'm, in a few hours when I'm thinking about your question more fully, I might change my mind. At the moment, I mean, I've done a lot on Kant's notion of analogy as well. I don't see the work that idea might do there for us, I guess, initially. As I understand Kant's notion of analogy, when you have these two domains, what's heterogeneous is kind of the content, the intuitive aspect, but the basis of the analogy is an identity categorially structurally on both sides. And so as I understand it, the heterogeneity would be in terms of intuitive content or something like this, right? But there's an identity structurally. Now maybe. So I don't know in the first part of the analytic what would be the intuitive content that we're that's different, and if there's it just seems like conceptual analysis purely, right? Before the two problems. I think once you get to the idea of a fundamental force, then the analogy. Definitely, this is analogical. And when you think of the moral law as a kind of mechanical force, which Kant very frequently does, right? Then this is an analogy. And when you think of moral relations like in analogy with things like action and reaction, as Kant often does, equality, this is an analogy, which fits the standard Kantian notion of analogy. But I just don't see what. Maybe one could say that when Kant talks about motives already in the first part there, maybe this is analogical in a certain sense, because so I'm starting to argue myself out of my class. See what I'm going to do. So already there, I think Kant is treating, he's talking about the fundamental determining bases of the will and underlying maxims, and so this notion of determination is probably already analogical. But I agree. There's probably material there. I don't know if that answers the straight up question though, about the lack of use of mathematics itself. I think it has to be something more like I know this is like the immediate question I'm going to get from so many people, and I feel like the chemistry move kind of deals with it a little more simply, because you don't need to apply mathematics to be able to do analysis and synthesis necessarily. It's just in the Principia you have to use mathematics to do that sort of analysis and synthesis, but chemical synthesis and analysis right, doesn't seem as if, well, Kant certainly thought it wasn't even possible at that point to use mathematics for that kind of analysis and synthesis. So now then you have the issue that for that reason, chemistry can't be truly fully scientific. But so that's all I can say.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and you also had this point on the optics being another possible source for Kant. The adoption of the synthetic analytic method in the optics. Okay, I see your point.
Yeah.
So I move to the second question, which regards analogical Newtonianism and Kant's anti-naturalism. How can we reconcile the two? And I really liked the claim you make towards the end of the paper, a claim to which you referred also in your presentation, and I am going to quote you. It's on page 27 of the PDF. In this regard, Kant's method in moral philosophy might best be termed meta-naturalistic, in the sense that it seeks to found moral science using a method generalized from that used in the natural sciences. And again, I tried to ask myself what notion of analogy actually is at play here. And if the relation existing between universal gravitation and the moral law is an analogy, does this mean they just share a set of features? Or does this mean we conceive of the moral law as if it shared some features with universal gravitation? Or in other terms, does analogy amount to a generalization of some features of Newtonian physics, or does it form a rule of correspondence between features which radically differ. And this is something you have pointed out to also in your presentation, that in a way we are not to conceive of this Kantian analogy in terms of generalization.
Yeah.
And so maybe I can reformulate my question by asking then, if it is not a generalization, then how are we to describe this analogy? Is it a rule of correspondence between the two domains? So this would be my second question.
Okay, yeah, so this is part of clarifying this and developing kind of a structure and a language to make this clearer, is part of what I'm thinking about now. Perhaps a better word there, but it wouldn't work in an article, is to say Kant doesn't generalize, he transcendentalizes there. No one would know what I meant by that, I suppose. So plenty, I see Kant's move and idea is radically distinct in some ways from other cases of analogical Newtonianism, because Kant is similar even in the prize essay. It's quite similar. Kant seems to be looking to natural science not in order to create kind of guiding metaphors for other domains. Kant is looking at natural science to discover in a concrete instance the structure of reason at work, right? See this as a product of the structure of reason. And then to ascend, this is the transcendental, to the level of considering that in separation from the specific domain. So in terms of, right, this is exactly what he's doing in the critique, is looking at the transcendental conditions of the possibility of experience, and this allows him to outline the categories and all these sorts of transcendental structures that then he applies again over in the practical. But this fits Kant's notion of analogy, because Kant thinks that analogy is the difference in two domains. It's not as if we look at science and then we say, oh, well, there's something like, but as if over in the practical domain. Conceptually, the same things are on both sides of the analogy. There's an identity underlying all Kantian analogy, identity in terms of pure categorical structure, right? The differences between the content in an analogy on each side, right? Or the objects. So this is one of the reasons I don't like the reference, the claim that Kant is an anti-naturalist. I think Kant is a meta-naturalist. I think so. He's continuing a natural. He thinks of himself as developing a genuine naturalism, but his genuine naturalism is kind of already there, right, in the first critique and in his definitions of nature, which is what nature in its most fundamental significance is anything that conforms to the structure of reason. Right? He says, why is there, in some notes, he says, why is there a nature? Because there is an understanding, which is the opposite of the Leibnizian view, that there is an understanding and reason because there's nature that mirrors it, right, and has that structure. So Kant turns this around there. So his definition of the natural is what's rational, not what is not metaphysically, whatever, right? So that's why Kant has these ideas of the supersensible, which is supersensible nature, not supernatural. Kant has no supernaturalism, although you see this in papers a lot. Like Kant, no, supernatural, that's irrational. So I think that Kant is trying to get at a deeper root, and this has roots in the in Baumgarten and previous thinkers, of a much broader metaphysical conception of the natural in terms of the rational. And in this respect, his practical philosophy is perfectly rational. And in this respect, it is natural because it conforms to the very same fundamental structures of rationality that are deployed with regard to sensible intuition and produce, science. Developing that, there's a lot to develop there, I think, to try to, that's the way I see it. Is that helpful?
Yes. So you think you take Kant to be one of those naturalists, as there are nowadays, or as John McDowell in the 90s, that are naturalists insofar as they have a very broad notion of nature, conceived of as a domain of rational knowledge, in a way.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I would. Yes. I think this is. I mean, these things have struck me. This is not kind of how I went towards Kant and understanding. But yeah, I think this is a helpful. I think there's plenty of this in contemporary attempts to. Well, I mean, the reductive naturalism, or even reductive methodological naturalism, I don't. Is certainly been, it's always there, but there are plenty of people trying to say you can still be a naturalist without saying everything is an object, everything that is an object of physical investigation, and so on.
Yeah.
And I think Kant is the same way. I don't see any tendency in Kant to move towards the supernatural, the anti-natural. I don't think that he's always couched everything. The transcendental philosophy begins with, we're going to imitate Copernicus, right? I think this is part of it. I think there's kind of if one wants to develop this story of Kant's kind of development of the meta-naturalism, it comes right with this Copernican move at the beginning of the first critique, and it's kind of, we already see it there. Kant looking to science for even the method by which to justify transcendental philosophy, but obviously not by doing empirical investigation of the transcendental structures of the mind, right? But by seeing how structurally does justification work with regard to paradigm shift, such as the Newtonian, right? And so this is kind of the transcendental naturalist move. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I can move maybe to the third question, if you all agree. And this regards just the possibility to further develop Kant's analogy between universal gravity and the moral law, and it is something you mentioned when answering the first question. And your account explains quite well what the defendants of Newtonianism wish to highlight when they frame universal gravitation in terms of a fact. I found those sections of your paper extremely interesting. Nevertheless, universal gravitation is not phenomenologically given. In fact, orbital motion is composed of gravity and tangential motion, and for this reason, a mental experiment is needed to separate the gravitational pole from the moon's orbital motion, and this is the famous moon test.
Mm-hmm.
And Newton is able to do this very elegantly. Do you think that there's something similar in the framework of Kant's moral philosophy? For example, may a single action be conceived of as the resultant of the drive to happiness and the moral drive? You were mentioning this before, right? So Kant often frames pathological and moral motives in terms of forces, which contrast one another, not logically, but really. So he's referring to this notion of real opposition. Mm-hmm. And as is well known, Kant often underscores the difficulties the moral philosopher runs into when trying to distinguish moral motives from pathological motives, mm-hmm, given a single action. So do you think we could draw or some analogy between the orbits, the way Newton understood the orbits
Mhm.
of celestial bodies in a Principia, and human action? Or do you think Kant works with this analogy as well? Because maybe such an analogy would enable him to separate, to solve this difficulty of separating moral motives from pathological motives in human actions. So this was my third question.
Okay, so I have two things to say that. First, let me directly respond. So I thought this is what I said in the paper, what you're suggesting. This was one of the things that kind of I wasn't expecting, and then suddenly this makes great sense, that just like until Newton has established the kind of bidirectional equivalence between universal gravitation and certain sorts of behavior, the orbits, until that point, he's incapable of separating out gravitational from non-gravitational forces, right? But once you know that any body deviating from the orbit must have another gravitational force or some external force other than gravitation. And this seems to be, there's longstanding, how can Kant ever introduce heteronomy? It makes no sense. And this would provide Kant with a very clear way of saying, I can't explain the possibility of heteronomy. That's what everybody wants. But I can show that there must be heteronomy because of our deviations from the moral law, right? So this kind of solves that problem. Once Newton has the law of gravitation and so on, he doesn't have to show the possibility or demonstrate these other forces. He can infer that those forces are there from the deviation, unknown, whatever they might constitute them. And this provides kind of an elegant solution to this problem for Kant. He doesn't have to explain how a free will can have heteronomous motives. Of course, we can explain how it has any motives because we can't explain it. But if it doesn't obey the moral law, then it cannot be as a consequence or as an expression of its freedom. So, that was a nice. I didn't want to put too much in the paper because I already. That raises a bunch of concerns. I already got some negative feedback on a version of this paper about that, and I'm like, well, okay. Something you said at the beginning, just let me briefly say. You were saying the law of gravitation is not. Did you say phenomena? What did you say?
Phenomenologically given, meaning that every orbit results, the path of the orbit results from the gravitational pole and the tangential motion.
Yeah.
So there is.
Yeah, this is the interesting thing about the Newtonian discussion, and this is to put some of my cards on the table. What I'm thinking about in the relationship to Kant is what the Newtonians seem to be like poorly trying to get at is something Kant actually clarifies with the distinction between appearances and things in themselves, which is that there is a kind of depth, causal depth of appearances, right? Without that depth being a move towards the unconditioned grounds of appearances themselves. And so the Newtonians are trying to say gravitation is first in the order of nature, but nature itself is only the realm of second causes. And God can do whatever God likes. So gravitation doesn't really explain anything like in a metaphysical sense. It's like a methodological concept. But at the same time, it's used in science as if it's a deep concept, right? That is explanatory and provides but their kind of discussion of first and second causes seems to make the use of the word gravitation merely a convenient fiction when they call it a cause, because ultimately it's not a cause. God creates everything kind of immediately, right? Clarke says natural causes have no force, right? In this one part of the letters with Leibniz, like, but I think Kant was, so with the appearance thing in itself distinction, Kant is able to say the cause. We cannot conceive of God as the cause of my table standing up because the cause is directly within the appearances, right? There's a causal depth, and we can infer and use the most abstract reasoning if we start, abstraction within appearances to reach deeper and deeper levels of appearance. And there, the role of a cause plays a real function that's not merely a fiction, but has a reality within appearances, without at the same time compromising the fact that the whole realm of appearances are not. This is not metaphysics, right? In this full-blown absolute sense of starting from first principles. I don't know how that just in my mind. I think there's something very similar going on in the practical. This is maybe my very radical view, is that I don't think Kant's practical philosophy exactly just gives us new veridical, kind of straightforward representations of the supersensible. But that this similar structure exists there. We have this first unconditioned principle. We don't know the essence of freedom. We can't represent freedom itself. All we know is what we have to represent of it because of the moral law. So upwardly. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'll
Thank
stop.
you.
Thank you very much for this very rich conversation. And now we can open the floor to the general Q&A. So if anybody wants to, well, any immediately. So please, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Courtney, for I think it's an amazing paper. It's been a long time that reading a paper on Kant, I had the impression to have so many new insights. I have one problems, let's say, with the parallel you draw between, on the one hand, Kant's moral law as a fact and gravitation as a fact. I numbered the pages of your article, and on page 16, you give this schematical parallel. And according to your thesis, I think, what are the orbits doing there as a fact, from which, so to say, you derive, but going up, the force of gravitation. And so where in this analogy between gravitation and orbits and moral law and freedom, it seems that freedom is something that is concluded metaphysically, whereas gravitation isn't, and the orbits aren't. I mean, Kepler's laws are verified empirically, and the force of gravitation is also stated being a fact. And you argue many times that there is no explanation to be given for gravitation. That's something for philosophers. Whereas if the moral law is a fact, the explanation or the cause, let's say the deeper metaphysical cause then being freedom, is something that is derived, but not as a fact, so to say. Not it doesn't have the same status as a fact, and so I don't know if this schematic presentation is helping your case.
Okay. First, let me admit one thing, which is, and then I'll give a kind of a cop-out as an answer for part of it, but then I salvage myself, hopefully, in the end. First, I totally agree that it's not clear to me if the analogy works perfectly for Kant. Now, I'm completely convinced that Kant believes there is this analogy, and I think that schematically it kind of works, right? Which is there's a law and there's a force, or a causality, right? And there is a kind of description of a law, and in universal in gravitation we get this description in Kepler's laws or so on, right? And in the moral law we get the fact of reason, which is the consciousness of the moral law, and these are the two given facts. And then there's this backward inference to the existence of a force, a causality that obeys, that results in behavior following that law, right? I think that is fine, and that parallel works quite nicely. I don't see what the problem is exactly with that. And then you get the equivalence, right? So already everything that gravitation is going to do, an inverse square law and so on, is already there in the hypothetical part of the Principia. The main thing is to start with the actual givenness of phenomena that obey that, and then to infer using the problems backwardly to the real existence of such a force. And so I say Kant does all this analysis at the beginning of the first chapter, and then when he presents the fact of pure practical reason, he then infers from it a causality in freedom, right? If such a law, and then he uses the inverse inference from freedom to such a law in the kind of synthetic part that follows, according to so I think that is very clear, and I believe that must be right. Now, the issue of what is called a fact on both sides is very complicated, and I wonder if it's complicated for the same reason. Because as you know, Kant also calls freedom a fact multiple times. He goes back and forth, right? And the Newtonians seem to not care either, whether you're talking about what directly appears or the thing that is inferred from what directly appears. Both of them are phenomena, right? This would be kind of like, I mean, this is why I say it's already something very Kantian. I mean, subatomic particles for Kant are phenomena, right? Like, just because we use rationality to move from one to the other, or logical reasoning, doesn't mean that both aren't apparent in some sense, in the key sense of distinguishing them from the whatever would be unknowable, right? So so this is my salvaging part. I think if I had more time, if I have thought about it more, and if I had more space in the paper, I haven't thought about it more mainly because I know there's no more space in the paper. If you have suggestions of how I can like avoid this while not making the paper another 20 pages, because it's already too long for any journal, I would be greatly appreciative. But I feel like the idea there is right. The details are a bit murky to me, and I don't know if that's because maybe it doesn't. Maybe Kant is using it, but it doesn't work in perfect detail. Maybe that's the case, right? But maybe it does, and maybe that requires a much more extensive story. Is that at all satisfying to you?
Yeah, I agree with what you say, but it's just that it might be puzzling perhaps for the reader that you attach in your paper constantly the word fact, both to the moral law and to Newtonian gravitation. But in the schematic presentation of the analogy, the fact is not attached to the same position in the argument. So it's the fact.
Misunderstanding, yeah.
So if you take page 16, so where you have Newton and Kant, the analogy, the word fact in your paper is constantly attached to gravitation, the force of gravitation, and not to Kepler's laws. Whereas in Kant, it is attached to the moral law, and you don't speak about freedom as a fact.
Yeah,
you did in your answer, no.
Yeah, maybe I've just written carelessly here. What I said is what I mean, what I wrote may not be. I'm gonna have to look. You may be correct, and it may be for the same reason. I think it is for the same reason, because when you read the Newtonians, they don't care what you're talking. It's all just a fact. They just put the two together. There's probably, I think there is a real good story why they do that, because they think of them as equivalent. So if one's a fact, the other's a fact. They're both, because when they say it's a fact, they don't mean it's what is first given to us in some sense. They mean they're distinguishing it from ultimate metaphysical things. They want to say it's like in the order of nature, not in the order of the primary cause. So fact is this very kind of counterintuitive. It just means an effect, but everything in nature is an effect. That's why they call it the first of the second causes, gravitation, right? So maybe yeah, that's helpful, honey. So maybe I should try to clarify that, but it's a very nuanced kind of story to tell, I guess.
Yeah, just a very small remark is that you talk about freedom as one of these metaphysical forces, so to say, in the beginning, and then that's like the metaphysical explanation we shouldn't be looking at for the law of gravitation or for gravitation, and that's why I think the parallel is not as clear as it could be.
Oh, I don't think that freedom should be thought of as a metaphysical cause in a normal sense.
No, I don't either. But in the beginning, I don't know on which page it is, but you quote Kant, who says
fundamental forces.
A fundamental force, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's within the order of nature. That's not metaphysical.
Okay, that was my point.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Annie. Is there any other question? Karen, please.
Yes. Yes, thanks, Courtney, and also for the discussion right now. I have a kind of related question to Henny's about the notion of facts, because I was wondering whether you considered also Kant's notion of factum in the context of the transcendental deduction of the first critique and the idea of a quaestio facti. And so I think I think it's hard to exclude that Kant was also inspired by the juridical practices that he discusses in the context of the transcendental deduction. Yes, where he also draws an analogy between what he's doing, but in this case with the jurists. And maybe this could be one example of what I see as a certain risk, namely that that you interpret his use of the term factum in this case exclusively in the context of Newtonian science, whereas it's possible that Kant associated his notion of factum also with different disciplines and practices. Yeah, so the fact that, well, the fact, let's say the fact that he in some regards draws analogies with Newton in terms of the methodology or in terms of the content, doesn't mean that he's doing this in all cases, evidently. Yes, and so with a term such as fact, and I think it has this meaning of deed, yes, or the deed, the act that has been accomplished. So it is possible that Kant. So I hope my point is clear. It's possible that Kant also drew on other contexts in his use of the term factum. Yeah. So I think that associating everything with Newton is maybe a bit risky.
Okay. Is that, are you still going? Or?
That's it.
Oh, okay. So, you know, I have an answer to this. Again, this is, if I'd sent you like 3 versions ago, you might be a little happier. Because I try to address this. Now it's just in like gestured in some footnotes. So, so everyone's familiar, I'm sure, the discussion on this, and there's this kind of division between possible natural, you know, physical fact analogies with the fact of pure practical reason, and then the juridical ones, or ones having to do with practical philosophy. And I don't see these as any way opposed to one another. Now, I don't think that the juridical one helps us to understand the structure of the second critique. I think the likelihood that Kant calls the moral law a fact of reason, and that he calls the law of pure practical reason there the fundamental law, is that naturalistic side, or that side is what's most important for understanding the methodology there. Now, why I say I don't see them in any way opposed is because in Kant's mind, they're not opposed. So he has a couple of notes. He says, basically, they're 2 species of the same thing, right? A physical fact and a moral fact are 2 species of res facti, right? What's the similarity? A fact is something given as an effect. The difference is that a physical fact, so every moral fact is given as a physical fact, right? That's how we encounter it. There is a murder. There is something that happens. A deed is a physical action, right? So the fact is always the result. This is why I brought in the Baumgarten stuff, right? Like has nothing immediately to do with the will. So the fact is presented. The question of whether it's a deed, a fact that is also in the sense a deed, or what one should call a moral fact, is the question of what kind of origin it had. Did it originate in someone's free will? Then it's a deed. So we have a fact. It's something. The core idea being something. Kant says that something that's actual, whose possibility cannot be questioned. But then the question is it caused by physical causes, and then that would be a natural fact, or is it caused by free will, and then it's a moral fact? And so I would bring them together and say, I think that methodologically Kant is using the Newtonian notion of fact, but then what does he infer? Unlike Newton, Newton infers the force of gravitation. Kant infers that the origin of the moral law is in the free will. Therefore, it's a deed. So my only kind of objection to the deed reading is that the physical Newtonian fact reading is prior, because it's about the analysis and establishment of the fact itself. And then there's the interpretation of the fact. So we don't know that, we can't start from the idea that the fact of reason is a deed. That's a result. It's a result of the analysis in the 2 problems. We learn that the thing that we find within ourselves originates in our free will, and so is a deed. So I see the 2 as perfectly, and I think this is super clever for Kant. Very typical of Kant to say there's not this one or the other. Right, he's playing on both senses of deed, and this creates a nice juncture between the scientific paradigm and the moral paradigm, right? The practical paradigm, and he hits on this. This in a way you could say there's a master analogy here. The master analogy is the notion of a fact, and it can have this physical sense or this moral practical sense. I feel kind of satisfied with that. So I would say I can kind of synthesize both points of view. except I don't see a way in which we can start at the beginning of the second critique with already assuming it's a deed. Because what's first given to us is law, not freedom. We have to infer its origin in freedom, so that it is a deed. That has to be an inference.
Yeah, well, maybe I can clarify something, yes, because I think I combine two aspects that maybe we should keep apart, because according to the explanation in the transcendental deduction of the juridical practices, Kant says, well, the jurists they had to determine a number of facts, or to go back to the facts before making a kind of normative assessment. And that discussion, I think, is different from the meaning of factum, yes, which also occurs there somehow. But so I was more interested in the quaestio facti, yes. So in this attempt to establish facts prior to determining the rightfulness of a particular claim.
Yeah.
And I still think it's a bit hard to exclude that Kant was also thinking of facts in that juridical sense, yes, or taking himself to go back from, let's say, our observations to some kind of original fact that needs to be established in order to make or to assess our normative claims.
Yeah. So you want to exclude this question of deed in a way. You want to look back at the. So I can't say that I don't have an immediate answer. I would be interested to know how you think that would be helpful in interpreting specifically what's going on in the second critique, kind of more concretely. There's a question of what maybe there is I can see a line there where there might be something going on. The question is what's the function of the quid facti in the transcendental deduction, right?
Yeah. And so that is already a hard question. And so I don't have a kind of clear idea about this, but it's just that I think that for us as interpreters, it's very hard to exclude other associations or analogies that Kant was drawing on, and to put everything on Newton, yes, or as a model. But so
I don't like excluding anything, but I'm focusing. I'm just focusing on the things that I guess I keep saying this again, do work for me.
Yeah.
Where I can see them, and I mean, first of all, the when starting to work on a paper like this, I mean, the first thing is even trying to convince anyone that there's anything there at all. And I think there's an immense amount there that we cannot exclude that Kant had Newton primarily in mind. I think I would say that.
Yeah.
That in the structure, it's primarily Newton, and he's drawing on these ideas. The question is there? I mean, maybe this helps. So I'm thinking maybe this helps me go back and say, well, what really was the positive role of the quid facti in the transcendental deduction? Is there something, because usually, the usual kind of boring explanation as well, he's just excluding the quid facti is what he's talking about, right? And he's just focusing on the quid juris. But obviously, there's going to be a connection between the two, right? Where you're going to have some facts, but then they're going to be traced back to separated out as to which of those is like grounded in the activity, transcendental activities of rationality as conditions of possibility and so on, right? So we have imagination, but there's this transcendental function of imagination comes up in the quid juris. So there might be something there, and I think this is general. I mean, but I don't. I would think that there is kind of this, even in that case, there might be this kind of master analogy going on, which is that Kant thinks of facts in general as effects, things that are given that are not themselves explained, that require a ground or a justification or something like this. That there's this kind of, or as he tries to put it in a formula late, right? Like that a fact is a thing whose which we don't know how it's possible, but whose possibility is guaranteed by its actuality, right? That's the fundamental kind of core idea of a fact, is that you can infer its possibility from its actuality. And this excludes, you know, this is obviously very useful in the practical case because it excludes any kind of metaphysical objections to the moral law or metaphysical objections to gravitation. Since it's given, it must be possible, so be quiet, right? Yeah, I mean, thanks for pushing that. I'll think more on it, but
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Please, Arnaud.
Yeah, thank you very much, Courtney. I enjoyed reading your paper. I don't want to overwhelm you with questions about facts, but since it's one of your argument, and I was really interested in your argument, I would just make a small comment, because you yourself say, well, the reader will be convinced or not by the evidence. I myself was not so convinced with just this parallel with Euler. If you say, well, you know, there is the same expression in Euler, and Kant must have read the book because everyone has. I would say it's not. It's not so compelling. My question is, in this, I don't know how you did this in your investigation to look after such phrases. Have you looked at the German translations of Rousseau's Emile? There are a couple of them. So the first one really early, and then two other ones, just to look whether the word, I have no idea, but if you say, well, you know, you can find the word in Rousseau, I would say, yeah, it's a little bit more compelling than Euler because of this famous passage on Achtung, the way it translates conscience.
Yeah.
And so that's only my suggestion. But that yeah, my remark on this. So, but that's not my question is about. So you've got a structural analysis, so analogy between the first chapter and Newton's, and you start saying, well, you know, you see all those technical terms, so a problem and corollary and theorem, and well, it mirrors Newton and not Spinoza, for instance. But in the end, you don't say that much about why he needs a theorem, why he needs a corollary, and can you can you explain a little bit more whether you can push the analogy that far? And I'm sure if you do, that would expand your paper even more, I know.
Yeah.
So that would be even longer. But perhaps it's, yeah, because if you don't have a real strong story about why he needs this, then it's just about mirroring the exposition of Newton's Principia, which is not so philosophically, you know, I would not say sound, but not philosophically deep. And it's just about the exposition and making something like a popular exposition of his book because, well, everyone wants to, in some sense, imitate Newton, and everyone wants to be the Newton on something. So, so do you have something like a more, I don't say, articulate? Yeah. You got my question.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
First comment on the if there are copies of the German translation of Rousseau out there, they probably originated in me because I once paid several $100s to get those scanned. So, and I think then they ended up with Jens Timmerman, and then maybe they're online now, probably on Google Books. But anyways, so they're very interesting, right? the translation is very interesting. For instance, there's everything that is sensible in Rousseau is translated as vernünftig. In I'm sure Kant would have liked that. But I don't guess it's everyone's image of Kant sitting under a tree reading Rousseau in German.
Okay.
There's something not romantic about that, I guess. But so, yeah, I don't know the Euler point. This might be a little bit of my, personal journey that shows that the importance of that, because I searched forever for how to. I mean, it might even just be more directly. The problem is in when you look for the word factum, it's quite rare. It's extremely rare. And the reference to like an undeniable fact and so on. So it's not just the word there in Euler, but it's kind of the formulation. And Kant, we know Kant, like, this was a work that Kant knew very, very well and so on. And that he had it in German and so on. So there's another case, I think it was the Buffon, was it, that I pointed out, where this is used as well. But so, but Kant, if you saw the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, this is it's all over there. It's just a matter of the word factum specifically and why he hit on it. So maybe it's a bit, I overemphasized it there a little bit, but when I found it, it was just so, it's like the only case that would have, that is just so obviously close to Kant that he could have like had it on his desk practically, right? So that's why I prefer, and he had this great admiration for Euler, right? All throughout, whenever Kant can refer to Euler, I think he felt like he was a better philosopher. So there's something there. I feel like there's something there. Maybe this is my too much thinking too much about how Kant thinks and so on. But maybe it's not super convincing. So I'll accept that. Second thing was about, oh yes. I don't know what the bigger story looks like. You mean what he needs? I mean, so the way I see it is the general methodology is the same, and Kant wants to not just the general methodology, but very specifically, Kant is setting up. It's kind of strange that the way the first chapter of the Analytic is you don't start with the fact of reason or something. You start with all of this hypothetical conceptual analysis, right? We don't know there's a free will, but we already know that if there's a free will, there will be such a law, and if there will be such a law, there will be a free. It's all this very hypothetical, which, it just makes sense that Kant is going to structure this the way Newton structured the first two books of the Principia, and he's going to try to separate them out in terms of an analysis of the fundamental components of these kinds of structures. It just makes sense to me. I don't know if he needs the terms so much, but I don't think there's much of an objection there that it's just kind of decoration, because the deep kind of method he's using is there as well, right? That would be a possibility. To me, that would still be very interesting, because first of all, the idea that Kant is in any way imitating Newton in practical philosophy comes, I think most people that I've met or showed this paper to is like, sounds absurd on the face of it, right? So from a scholarly point of view, if this can like clarify even what Kant was trying to do, I mean, teaching the second critique and trying to teach that first section and like, what is Kant doing here? Why are these terms here? It's just kind of impossible to explain the structure. Now this, so from the side of Kant, understanding what Kant's argument is, I think seeing this synthetic move and this analytic move and the hypothetical part and then the presenting of the fact and so on, just for a Kant scholar as myself, this just is illuminating, even if one cannot, even if there weren't a deeper philosophical point. But I think there really is this deeper philosophical point that Kant is meditating and finding a method for trying to defend just like Newton was defending gravitation against the Leibnizians, trying to defend something that is not demonstrable against claims that the only way to defend anything is by demonstrating it rationalistically from first principles, and that this is So if you have some suggestion about what more that story could look like to make it more convincing, like why he needs these, I would steal that from you, but I'm not sure what that would be.
No, I don't know. That was an open question. It's only, you have quoted this place where Kant says that Rousseau was the Newton of a moral world, just like, Newton was,
Yeah, sure.
And, well, at some point, a suggestion would be, well, he wanted to push this thought a little bit further, and not only have a, just like a kind of big analogy, but, let's do it and be really the Newton of a moral world in a most strict sense. That was just my suggestion, and that's why I wanted to know whether you can have a bigger story to, since Kant himself draws a parallel between first Rousseau and Newton on one side, and of his own work with Rousseau on the other side. Well, perhaps there is a link that would just, but it's perhaps too speculation. So I just grant it to you. But
there is one thing that maybe you're thinking about here, or that I've been thinking about, which is I think when Kant comes to actually trying to understand and analyze what universality of a law means. I think this is where he sees, like, there's something. Rousseau really was like Newton in this way, that other people have these ideas of general laws, right? I mean, everybody does, right? Of general laws, we generalize our self-love or whatever. But this idea of universality is fundamentally different. And it rests upon this idea of symmetry and reciprocity that you see exemplified in gravitation, right? Two bits of matter, equal and opposite, that Kant likes to use to illustrate things like, analogically, he even says you use these concepts to construct the concept of right in the doctrine. So it's, I won't go, that has to do with this construction of the analogy kind of thing, to exhibit these principles. That, I mean, I think when Kant is analyzing moral situations and so on, he's really trying to push that analogy. Well, there should be an identity and the kind of structure that universality requires of the relationships between the members. So I think there's a big story there, a very interesting story, where Kant is kind of, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is in some sense understood very strictly in terms of through the analogy with Newtonian, reciprocal forces and so on. So I want to write a paper on looking at Kant's actual analysis of moral cases and seeing how this thinking about universality in the realm, how it applies to matter and so on, the gravitation, whether Kant, this does some work for him, I think. So it's a very interesting idea, making it much more tight, this connection. I think that's a special thing about Rousseau in his analysis of the general will and so on. It's not just a general law. It has this very special kind of, I don't know how to explain it, but it's much more like a law of gravitation. Counterintuitive in many ways in its results.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think I might have a follow-up on what Arnaud was saying about the Euclidean structure of the first part of the critique. And so I'm no expert on Kant, but I've studied Maupertuis for a few years. And so as you mentioned in the paper, Maupertuis was at least until a certain date a committed Newtonian in many senses, and he actually as many passages of text which are strictly opposed to the Spinozist way of proceeding in philosophy, so by definitions, propositions, corollaries, and so on. But when he writes a treatise on morals in 1749, he actually presents the contents in a kind of geometric, in a kind of Euclidean way as well. So despite making assertions against this way of doing philosophy, when it comes to morals, he adopts this kind of structure in presenting his arguments. I'm not really sure why, in Maupertuis's case, he does that, but there is no strict Euclidean structure, but in a certain way, he uses the terms lemma, corollary, definition, and so on. So there is this idea, and it might be an analogy between a Newtonian, if not Newton himself, and what Kant is doing. There might be similarities. And the second, not even a comment, but just an observation that I made while reading your paper as a Maupertuis scholar, as it were, is that, so you mentioned the Discours published in 1732 and the presence of the word fact, fait, ou fait, to denote attraction. And so one interesting point about that specific treatise is that Maupertuis, so as you know, in the second chapter, attraction is discussed, and the factual nature of this principle is stressed because it's metaphysically obscure in a certain way, but any principle, so as soon as we try to go beyond the impressions of our senses, everything is obscure and unintelligible. So we need to stick to that level. But so my feeling is that when he introduces the question de fait to refer to the investigation of whether attraction actually acts in nature or not, what he has in mind is that the factual level is the level where mathematics can where we can explain things through mathematics. So we can stick to the facts, meaning that if we can find mathematical regularities which can be explained mathematically, then we can make sense of something in nature, even if we cannot attain any deep truth or metaphysical certainty beyond it. So what strikes in comparison with the use Kant makes, although I'm not sure too that it's really spot on, is that there is, at least in Maupertuis, a sort of skeptical point of, like, a skeptical perspective on this factual question of fact. So he's a radical empiricist and a skeptic, and he insists on the fact that there is no certainty, no intuitive access to reality, and thus we need to stick to the factual level, because only through mathematics can we have a more or less stable form of knowledge.
You're saying mathematics as applied to the physical world.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, might be totally irrelevant to your argument. Just a small footnote.
No. I should read that again. Were you talking about the essay, not the essay on moral philosophy, 1749? Yeah,
the Philosophie Morale. Yeah.
But I don't. Yeah. Maybe we can talk later. I don't see any corollaries or anything like that in there. But I'm just looking at it for
yeah.
Yeah. I think this, exactly what you're describing, if I understand it correctly. This is what we kind of see all over these texts from the Newtonian side, is, and within the history of philosophy of science and so on, this makes a lot of sense, that there's a sort of, not necessarily skepticism, or, well, I don't know if we call it skepticism, but a kind of throwing one's hands up and saying there's so much basically the ultimate foundations of the world we do not know, and we have to restrict ourselves to what is amenable to empirical and mathematical treatment, and have this kind of very what would you say, modest approach, which is exactly what Kant does in the prize essay and so on. It says metaphysics needs to act this way. It's motivated in various different ways in these authors. I mean, in like a number of Newtonian authors, it seems to be like a kind of like an, I don't know if it's voluntarism or it's some kind of theological, like, you know, in Clarke, it's inscrutable, the ultimate foundations of things, and so we need to restrict ourselves only to the facts, right? You see this in John Clarke's text that I quoted, which I think I'll take out of the new version of the paper. And this is kind of so they use, like, in their fight against the rationalists, is like this constant, like, there's something not pious about your position. You want to pry into the genuine causes. And that's a situation of human beings, is that we must restrict ourselves to the facts, which they don't, the facts are not, like we would say now, the indisputable things or whatever, because they can be disputed. Sticking to the facts means sticking to this realm of what is available to us and is amenable to these methods, right? That just seems to be a general standpoint that many people are pushing. You see it in Buffon, you see it in others, and I'm guessing, you know, as you described Maupertuis there, he's doing something very, very similar in his own way. This kind of just trying to distinguish ultimate real causes, which are the divine and unknown, from the kinds of things that can be treated in natural science, and do so without undermining science in any way, while giving science some kind of autonomy with respect to that. This is why I kind of see maybe it's this more general problem that phenomena noumena distinction in the prize essay and so on is trying to solve, right? Without metaphysics justifying the necessity of natural scientific principles, right? And distinguishing two senses of cause, right? Which is what has to be done. I don't know. This I was going to ask you. Does Maupertuis do this? Does he use this theological language of primary cause and secondary causes as well? Because this is another thing that many of them seem to hit on. Physics needs to restrict itself to the secondary causes, and gravitation is the first of the secondary causes.
But I think that at least in the 1732 discours, he takes over from Locke just the primary secondary qualities distinction. But he says that, but he basically says that when it comes to causes, whether they are, I mean, any kind of cause is by definition inaccessible to our knowledge. So the only primary secondary distinction you have is that between qualities. But when he used the word cause, as far as I can remember, there's just the effect cause distinction. As you said in the paper, effect equates with fact, more or less. But no, in general. And he also had this kind of occasionalist approach to causation, but every time he tries to speak of potential causes of gravitation or other phenomena, he always introduces the argument of the discussion saying, well, it is a conjecture. I speak by way of analogy. The words I'm saying do not really mean anything particular, but it's just by way of saying or by conjecture. So I'm never really sure what his take really is on this, like, potential distinction between primary and secondary causes or causes more generally.
Yeah. This is so this is I'm really interested in this question right now, or how to see Kant in this relationship, and how the kind of what the Newtonians want as scientists is to be able to talk about causes without bother, while distinguishing those from, like, ultimate causes. So they want something that I think that philosophers are going to say, well, no, these are just appearances, like Locke. You can't know the causes. You just know how you're affected. And the Newtonians want that distinction, but they don't want to give up causes in science. And this is exactly what Kant's phenomena-noumena distinction allows us to do, to locate causes within the appearances and substances within the appearances, while keeping this unknown, inscrutable foundation in the background, because it's very useful as a way of distinguishing what your science pretends to do from absolute divine knowledge, right? And allowing you to justify it from within in terms of the function it plays for making science possible and so on, right? So this is kind of what I've been, I don't know, I had never, oddly, as much as I was educated in Leuven and I had this distinction between primary and secondary causes, I was completely unfamiliar with. So it wasn't until like last week that I realized that's what all these people are referring to, like in these texts, and it's right there in Clarke as well, right? This distinction. If someone has a good source on that, tell me out. I found it in some other Mueller, who's, I don't know if anyone knows who that guy is, but one of the Thomasian pietists lays it out very clearly. But if there are other sources, if anyone has to send me, I would like to have those. I would be very appreciative. But thank you, Marco. And I'll look in. Maybe you can send me that citation about the thing in Maupertuis, about the corollaries and so on.
Yeah, but yeah, that's the discussion will be more complex. But it's just you never, as far as I can remember, never really separates. But if you read the text, he actually presents the text, and I reconstructed the text. And you can find the definitions and then the calculations, and in contemporary readings of the text and reviews, people take it as a mathematical treatise or a geometrical treatise. So it's quite interesting that the structure is that of a Euclidean, although it's a bit dissimulated. But I wrote a part of a paper on that. So
oh yeah, if I could read that, right? Yeah, I see. I see. I just don't see it wasn't broken up.
Yeah.
But if it's in the text, and I'd be interested to see what I should look at the German translation of this, because it's probably what Kant would have read. And I have no doubt, I mean, yeah, Maupertuis is fascinating and super important for Kant, I think. There should be a lot more on that.
Is there any other question from the audience? Karin, yes, please.
Yeah, so I do have another question, but if there are other participants who haven't yet asked their question, I think they should go first. So no one who wants to raise their hand at this point? Okay, then I'll go ahead. Yeah, so about this Euclidean or quasi-Euclidean method. So it was used widely, as you also mentioned, by Wolff and the Wolffians, and also by Newton, and I guess also Newton's followers. So, and by Maupertuis. So it was very widespread. And so while reading the paper, I felt that that you maybe draw too closely together the use of these headings and the more contentful aspects. And so I thought you were a bit quick in dismissing the idea that Kant also borrows from, let's say, a more rationalist tradition as regards the mode of exposition that he chooses and that he thinks is useful. Whereas in terms of the actual way he proceeds, he might be very close to Newton. Yes, so I get the point about Kant's method not being synthetic from the very beginning, but starting from an analysis, starting from observations, in order to get to an indubitable facts and to derive stuff from there. But I I think I would separate this layer of how Kant proceeds more strictly from the use of headings that were also used in other traditions, and that could also be used within a more strictly synthetic procedure. Yeah, so it seems, you see what I mean? So I think that okay.
Yeah, so I mean, several different pieces to my response here. One is that, as I pointed out, the actual use of problems you don't find in anyone else, except for maybe Euclid himself.
Okay.
So Spinoza does not use these. Wolff doesn't use these when he does it. He has the terms and so on, but he doesn't use it in philosophy in this way. As far as I don't know of any relevant. So the question is, I guess I'm going kind of genetically the other ways. Like, if Kant's trying to imitate Newton's method, or generalize from Newton's method, then it makes sense that this is the primary source. He could get these terms directly from Euclid, of course, but I think he, first of all, would not have gotten them from. He didn't want to give anyone the idea he was imitating Spinoza, certainly, or a rationalist method. And I think there's generally there are, everyone wants to use this method in the period, as you say, right? But when they use these headings, they have fundamentally different ideas associated with them. Whether you're using them in a rationalist context, or you're using them in the Thomasian Pietists use them as well, the full range, but they reject the mathematical method. So there's another example of people who use these kinds of headings without subscribing to a rationalist interpretation of them.
Yeah. Okay. So that supports my my concern. Yes. That.
Yeah. But what's I mean, I accept that that's the case, but what's kind of the primary cause of Kant's adopting them in this case? So Kant adopts them nowhere else, right? Not even in the metaphysical foundations of natural science does he fully adopt them. Why here, in this specific case, I can only see it because he really wants to suggest the structure of the first chapter of the Analytic is in a much more strict way, analogically related to Newton's method. And part of what I wanted to do there, kind of the idea is push the analogy as far as it can go and see what it can do interpretively, right? And see if, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I cut out of the paper. I think there are a lot more ways this can illuminate what Kant is doing, but you can't prove any of this, right? You can't prove what was in Kant's mind. You can only say, does this illuminate the text in a way that doesn't, otherwise there's no explanation as to what this text means. And so the other thing is, Kant had just written the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, in which there are probably hundreds of references to the Principia. So he's been reading it intensely. And I think it's true that he went back, and I just discovered this after a note from Stefano Baccin telling me kind of Kant had kind of done this in the first critique a little bit. Then I discovered his introduction of this general scholium at the end of the Principles in the exact same period, right? So I don't know if anyone's pointed this out before. I think that is exactly Kant's wink, as I call it, to Newton.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so that's clear. And so a small thing. I was reading something on the second introduction to the third critique, the published one, and someone claims that the structure of the introduction is very similar to the structure of an introduction by Hume, by a text by Hume on beauty, but I do not know which text. I don't remember, but I thought that was interesting that someone else, with regard to a different text, also identified these parallels. Yes, which in a way support your point that Kant in different texts for different purposes somehow imitates or takes over available structures to organize his own material.
Yeah. I've been seeing more and more. I mean, this is because I do this kind of very, very minute analysis for some reason. I'm obsessed with, you know, figuring out every little source that Kant has for things. And his mind is just like, it just takes everything in and reorganizes it into the right shape. I mean, Herder has something like this. I think he has a quote like, Kant took everything of the century and synthesized it into his own kind of product. And there's a nice circle there because, of course, Hume at various points imitates Newton. So he's imitating Newton and Kant's imitating him. So also, I mean, just to give an example, just the other day, I don't know if anyone else discovered this. I've been working on the second critique, and Kant there, when he's talking about moral harmony, makes this reference to the king of two kings declaring that they both wanted Milan. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. And Kant doesn't give any footnote or whatever. It's to illustrate moral harmony. And I had been looking for where that, I knew that came from something. Kant didn't invent it because he doesn't invent these things. And I'd been looking for about 2 years, and then I found it like on Thursday, right in Crucius, to illustrate the same point. Not just as if he's, you know, let's not call it plagiarism, but he has an analogical mind.
Yes. Yeah. I completely agree. Henny disagrees.
And he disagrees with everything. No, he's very agreeable.
Oh, please, Annie, you have a question?
Yes, I had another concern. So although I'm very sympathetic to your paper and to your work and person in general, and it's about the coming together in a way of the metaphysical foundations of natural science, which is from 1786, and then the Critique of Practical Reason being of 1788. And you just mentioned that you've read the metaphysical foundations. What strikes me in relation to what you say in your paper is that Kant seems to take some distance from following Newton in this specific respect, that he thinks it is possible to do a metaphysics for certain fact. And so in the metaphysical foundations, what you have is that there's a fact that space is filled with some matter, and you're going to give a metaphysics of how filling of space is possible. And so then you give these metaphysical fundamental forces, a thing that Newton never would have done, so to say, to explain gravitation. And I wonder in how much this affects, so to say, the analogy when I mean the status of something that is said to be a fact. In Newton, it was said to be a fact as a defense against Leibniz, to say, well, even if you can't understand it as a philosopher, it's still a fact. It seems that in the metaphysical foundations, Kant is more Leibnizian in a way. He tries to find a kind of explanation that is not apodictically certain, and he is conscious of that. And he also says, well, even people like Newton, they must have some metaphysical presuppositions, even if they don't explicitly spell them out. So, well, it's not a very structured question, but I just wondered, does this affect somehow your thesis about this, the status of a fact, how it's considered to be in Newton and then in Kant? Because for Kant, something is a fact, but it still allows for metaphysical grounding, and he also thinks this is something that we necessarily have to engage with, because it's something that is rooted in human nature, the metaphysical tendency. And yeah, it's just
yeah, no, it's a great question. So, you know, I may be wrong about this, but as I'm, you know, this is kind of a developing idea, is that this is kind of a hidden, kind of on the surface motive of Kant, is to find a real philosophical justification for what Newton was doing without having a consistent way to explain it. I think the Newtonians didn't have a consistent way to defend their position. And the solution is distinguishing two versions of metaphysics from one another, right? So think of metaphysics not in terms of like what we generally do, but in terms of this first principles of human knowledge idea, right? You need foundations. Kant thinks, I think you need foundations. I think Newton thought you needed foundations. That's why he has his rules of induction and so on. He just didn't know what to call them. He initially called them hypotheses, and then later he changed the names of them to axioms, which is an interesting story. In the first edition, they were titled hypotheses. He didn't know, and so in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, Kant, I think, thinks there is this transcendental metaphysics that can be done, which its role there is to lay out the first principles of scientific knowledge. But that's the sense of metaphysics there, that he thinks Newton should have had, but didn't have, because Newton and the Newtonians couldn't distinguish between that kind of metaphysics and this kind of transcendent metaphysics that would somehow require a divine principle or something, right? So in this way, so Kant does change, you know, Kant's Newton is not Newton exactly. Kant thinks, for instance, unlike Newton, he can prove that universal gravitation must be a fact. Namely, meaning it can't be given in any other way, because it's a first fundamental force, right? He says this, right? So it's like, to Newton, that the gravitation as a fact is just kind of a contingent matter. But for Kant, it's like, no, there's like, I have a transcendental framework that shows that kind of, we're going to bump up against eventually inexplicable fundamental forces, and gravitation must be one of these because of its universality and so on. And so I can draw the boundary between the metaphysics that has its real function in science and that other metaphysics that is a waste of time very clearly. So that science doesn't get undermined, and we don't, you know, we're not tempted to extend scientific understanding to religion, right? And we create this nice, clear boundary between the two. So I don't see it as I see it as a point of direction for development, but I don't see it as a problem, I guess. Does that make, or is there still a problem? So this is very speculative and non-Kantian sense.
I wasn't even saying that there is a problem, just a consideration if it somehow
That's really
affects your position. Yeah. Thanks.
Is there any last question? If not, please join me in thanking once again Courtney for the very nice session, and thank you all for participating and discussing with us. And Next session will be in January. We don't have any invited speaker yet, so we're working on it on the calendar, but we'll keep you posted. And thank you very much again, and have a nice day or evening, depending on the part of the world where you are.
I have a dentist appointment.
Oh, wow. So good luck with that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you all
Ciao.
very much. Excellent questions.
Okay. Bye, everyone.